Hello, everybody. We are here to cover chapter one, the first of our actual content for the class. So let's get rolling. Okay, so this is what we are going to do today. I'm going to zoom through parts of it, and linger on other parts of it. We have other places where we're going to talk about practice and the methodology. There are some things about it that are really important to know, and other things about it that are less important to know at this point in your education. So a little uneven there, but let's see how we do. Okay, so just some basics. Um, the things that we're going to work on this week, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that they're wildly interesting. They're not wildly interesting. But like I said, it is a little bit of background that we really need. So, what is psychology? Psychology is the scientific study of mental processes and behavior, and literally the word means soul knowledge. So, when we talk about psychology as learning about the brain and how the brain works, it is the brain and how the brain works, but it's deeper than that. It's also about how we think, and some people consider it to be spiritual. So, you will notice there is a theme in the early pioneers. Um, William Wundt was kind of, basically the originator of modern psychology as we think of it. And then William James, Wilhelm Wundt, I'm sorry, William James really is our first American psychologist. You will all have heard of Freud. Everybody has heard of Freud. We will, unfortunately, talk about Freud several times this semester. He's not my favorite, and you'll learn about why. Um, but John Watson, is like the anti-Freud. So, Freud thought everything was about the unconscious. John Watson thought everything was about, what's happening on the surface, what's being rewarded and what's being punished. Wow. Okay. So, what they all have in common is that that's a lot of old white guys. And the reason behind that is obvious. If you know anything at all about history, you will understand that the discrimination of anybody who was not essentially a white man was really real, is still really real, but was much more obvious at this point in history. Um, I want to highlight Mary Calkins. She was the first female president of the American Psychological Association, but she has an interesting story. She went to Harvard, gathered everything that she needed to get a PhD from Harvard, but they refused to give her a PhD. And that was about it was about, well, we've never given women PhDs before, so why would we do it now? And multiple attempts have been made since Mary Calkins was, well, as a matter of fact, she's been dead for quite a while, but, since she finished at Harvard, and all throughout her life and after her life to get Harvard to capitulate. And honestly, the last attempt was 10 years ago, and they're still saying no, because it's, something about the integrity of the historical record, which is just, you know, if you ask me what I think about that, it's sort of a stupid reason. We have many, many examples of, writing the historical record. The historical record is rife with inequity. I don't think that they would say the same if this was about, race or anything other than gender, honestly. So, yeah, so there are many, many, many arguments that we can make to refute this logic, but regardless, Harvard refuses to give in so far. Okay. But despite the fact that women and minorities hold a much less visible role in early psychology, nevertheless, they really played a really important role in early psychology. So, Margaret Washburn was the first woman to receive a PhD in psychology, right? So Mary Calkins was the first one to complete at Harvard, but she certainly was not the first one to complete. And Margaret Washburn actually got her PhD. George Sanchez was an early pioneer in educational and cultural psychology. He was a Mexican American. He did a lot of work in the Hispanic community. So really, really cool work by George. So, yeah, I mean, what this is all leading us to is that the biggest problem with psychology today is that the research really still is from these sources, right? Like a lot of the research builds upon research that came before it. I think that makes sense. That's true in every field. But if we start from a place of basically doing research by and for white men, then we're building on research by and for white men. And that leads to a lot of issues with applicability, representation, visibility, inclusivity, all sorts of stuff. And so we're really perpetuating these high levels of implicit and explicit bias in society. And we're going to talk more about what those words mean as we go forward. But implicit is basically unconscious. So these are biases that we hold, but that we're not really aware of on a conscious level, and explicit bias are the ones that we're aware of. We might not necessarily act on them, but we're certainly aware of them. Okay. Another problem with measuring a few problems with measuring psychological concepts from this perspective is that having such a narrow view of human experience, uh, and when I say that, what I mean is taking it from, a westernized, white viewpoint, pretty much erases all the other cultures, right? So, that's a big problem. That's why I put it at the top. It's pretty much the main problem. Other ones involve the evolution of theories. A lot of theories don't really grow much with time in society. They don't change a whole lot over time. And that's an issue because, as society changes, we change, right? So the other issue is that often there's this desire to kind of try to fit people into one theory or another. And that is just not how people work, right? We're more complex than one theory. We cannot be explained. There is not one unitary theory of human psychology, right? So we're not going to be able to do it by saying, well, Freud had it right. Wilhelm Wundt had it right. Like, we're not going to be able to do it that way. We are much more complicated than just that one perspective of that one theorist. And most of them understood that, right? Like, most of them understood this is my this is my um uh, a theoretical orientation, but there's more to human beings than this. Not all, but most saw it that way. Um and then there's this issue that when we try to boil people down to a theory or two theories or three theories, we're taking away humanity, right? We're trying to turn people into book chapters. And it's dehumanizing in a way that can be really can make people feel very nervous about the study of psychology. And I would say, as someone who has worked in social work and psychology my entire career, that this is why so many people are hesitant to engage with psychology as a field or with people who study it, right? Because they feel like, I don't know, you have a beam into their soul, and that they can be read like a book, and that is just not the case, right? So trying to boil folks down to, how they fit into a theory takes away, who they are as people, their complexities as people. And also, you know, there's a hubris involved in a theory where, oh, you fit into this box. And but what about all the parts of a person that don't fit into a box? What about that, right? And so, you know, things change over time, and it it's interesting to look at previous versions of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the book that we use for diagnosis, right? And it has versions. The DSM has versions, and if you look at previous versions of the book, it takes what we now consider to be just normal parts of human experience, for example, homosexuality, and calls it a mental health issue. So, the box doesn't always fit people, and then the box changes, right? So we have to understand that psychology is a bit of a unique science, because though we can measure much of it, and we can uh, put visualizations to a lot of it, which we can with hard sciences as well. Um, you know, Physics doesn't change, right? Our understanding of physics changes, but physics doesn't change, whereas psychology does change, right? Some of it doesn't, but a lot of it does over time and with cultural shifts and all of that stuff. So, we have to be very careful with how we measure. All right. Here is another part that you have to be very careful about, right? So, often people take a psychology class or get a psychology degree or get two psychology degrees or three psychology degrees and think that now they're an expert. And let me just tell you, there is no amount of class that you can take, and certainly not one class, and an introductory class that makes you an expert in people. So be very careful about labeling people or diagnosing people or walking up to somebody and being like, oh, we learned about this in class. You have this or that, right? Like that causes real harm based on no real knowledge, right? So getting an overview does not mean that you have a true understanding, right? This is a survey course. It helps give you a taste. But just because you know how to taste a pie does not mean you know how to bake one. Right. Okay. So, these lectures that we're looking at, these slides that you're looking at, the core of them came from the publisher, right? So especially the ones where you see the little numbers at the top. So the the publisher and the book, right? So they're based on the book. The publisher um has put a frame around current psychology that puts these as the contemporary perspectives. So, yeah, I mean, they are some of the current perspectives, but these really are Western classical perspectives of psychology, right? They really, really are. Um, but what about all the other perspectives? Are these not current, right? So, I will admit to you that I had to pull this list off of an AI list that I grabbed. But the point that I'm trying to make is that there are many other ideas of psychology out there, right? I don't know very much about any of these, right? I've heard of a lot of them. I don't really know that much about them, and that is because I am Western classically trained, and you're about to be too, and here's why. We have a class, and everybody has a class that has a prescribed outline to it. The state has an outline that was agreed upon by, a bunch of psychology professors who sat in a room and said, we need to cover Freud, we need to cover Watson, we need, we need to cover this topic and that topic. And once they're done saying the things that they learned in school when they were learning introduction to psychology, there isn't space left in the class to do much more, right? So that's an issue, right? Like I consider that to be a major problem with our modern education in psychology, because we really do need to explore different, more diverse views of how the mind works. And we just don't have that freedom in what we're doing right now. So as we go forward in this class, I really want you to think carefully about not just what you are learning, but what you are not learning. Okay, so with that all said, so you can pause the lecture and read these more carefully if you want, but there are a number of different types of applied psychologists. So these are folks who work directly in the field with people towards a certain goal. But there's also research psychologists, and these are people who don't really work with people directly. I mean, they have people that they study, but they're not clients, right? These are folks who are doing research to further the field, to refine the field of psychology. These are the folks who, when you go on to four-year school, probably you will participate in research studies. You'll be required to participate in research studies as a part of classes that you take in psychology. That is very, very common. Again, it's an issue if we're doing studies on college students. That is not a representative sample of the population, but that is very common way to do it. But anyway, these are not clients, they are subjects, whereas on the previous slide, they were clients. All right. This is a really common misconception: psychologist versus psychiatrist. Psychiatrists are doctors. They are medical doctors. They went to medical school. They can write scripts for prescriptions and all of that stuff. If you get a boo-boo, they can treat it. That's not really what they, do on a day-to-day basis, but they have the same training as any other doctor. But psychologists, they have a lot of different things that they do, but they're not doctors, right? I mean, they might be PhDs, but they're not medical doctors, right? And so a lot of times psychologists focus on testing. So for learning disabilities, for ADHD, for all sorts of stuff. They can also do therapy. Not all therapists are psychologists, not by a long shot. Most therapists are not psychologists, actually. And not all psychologists are therapists, right? So a lot of psychologists only do that testing, right? They only do that consulting work with, companies who want to improve the lives of their employees, that sort of thing. So how do you find to help? So if you are looking for a therapist, you're generally, and I'm talking here about whether you're in California, right? Because it's a little bit different in other states. Every state calls these things slightly different things. But in California, in general, you're going to be looking for a licensed clinical social worker. That's a social worker who has done some extra work so that they can do therapy. There is also licensed marriage and family therapist. It sounds like they only do family and marriage work, but they don't, right? They do individual work as well. And an LPCC, they also do counseling and therapy and that sort of thing. So these are people who are specifically trained to do therapy. Do not assume that more school means more competence, right? So if what you need is therapy, you probably don't want somebody with a PhD because that person was very likely trained to do research. Now, there's something called a PsyD, where you get kind of an advanced degree in psychology, and it really is clinically focused to help folks, usually through therapy. But the point that I'm trying to make is that really good therapists are almost never doctors, sometimes, but almost never doctors, and don't have to be psychologists. So, just keep that in mind if you're searching for help in the future. So, speaking of PhDs, this is the highest level of education that you can get in psychology. Um, it kind of annoyed me a little bit that in your book, it only gave you a chart about where recent PhDs in psychology are employed. That's great or whatever, but there's a lot of people who have bachelor's degrees in psychology and master's degrees in psychology, and it's probably much more helpful data for you to have. So I don't have that data, but what I do have is a bachelor's in psychology. And let me tell you a little bit of something that I have learned, both from my own experience, but also by teaching undergraduates for, years at this point. A bachelor's degree in psychology is almost always a stepping stone to something else, right? So, it's usually about I'm trying to prepare myself for a graduate degree and something related. So social work or actually lots of things, a graduate degree and lots of things. If you go back a couple of slides and you look LPCC or MFT or whatever, a lot of those folks have bachelor's degrees in psychology. Um, but uh, it is not like a bachelor's in accounting, right? Like you can't take a bachelor's degree in psychology and then go work with people as a professional in psychology. Not really, right? What you can do is you can take it and you can apply to entry level jobs in, say, case management or something like that. But you can't make it very far unless you have more, right? So remember that bachelor's degree in psychology is either really good for personal interest, really good for a stepping stone, but it's not going to set you up for a career in psychology. That is not what a bachelor's in psychology does. So just be really, really clear about if a bachelor's in psychology is your goal, why it is your goal. Like I said, I have a bachelor's in psychology, but I also have a master's in social work and a master's in human and community development. And I just want to point out I would not be able to hold this job that I have right now, speaking to you, um, if I did not have that bachelor's degree, right? So basically the job requirement says you can have a master's degree in social work, good for you, but if you don't have a bachelor's degree in psychology, you're not qualified to teach. So, like that is a an interesting kind of twist to this sort of thing, but that's the point that I'm trying to make is like I couldn't teach you if I only had the bachelor's in psychology. I also need a master's degree, but if I didn't have it, the master's degree would not be enough. So that's an interesting twist, right? But anyway, if you have career questions, if you're interested in a path in human services and you have career questions, I'm more than happy to have a chat with you about those. Okay, and now for something completely different. So we have two ideas that were in your reading. If you did the reading, you will find them familiar, that feel kind of unrelated, but they're not unrelated. They're related, and I don't feel like your book does a particularly good job of telling you how, so I'm gonna help you figure that out. Okay, so the first idea is natural selection. If you've taken evolutionary biology, you sort of understand what this is. Natural selection is essentially survival of the fittest. I took this chart from your book, so it should feel pretty familiar to you. So basically, if you have an advantage, you're more likely to survive to create babies who will survive to create babies, that sort of thing. Okay, so I'm gonna give you a little bit of tip about your notes here. Underneath this blue blob is the next slide. And what I want to tell you is that when you see a slide like this is just like a big giant wall of text. Your best bet is to just listen to me talk about it or to read it through yourself and then decide, why is this there? Right? Like, why is this whole thing there? What am I trying to say about this? And then write down whatever that takeaway is. You do not have to try to copy it all down. You will stop listening. You will not be able to engage with what we're actually talking about. So just try to think it through using your critical thinking skills that you also learned about in your reading this week, and then write down what feels important and be engaged with the lecture in that way. Just write down what feels important and just be thinking about the bottom line. Okay, so here it is. Um so this slide is talking about sickle cell. Okay, so sickle cell anemia is a genetically quite simple disease. When you have one copy of the allele, you're resistant to malaria. Yay! But if you get two copies of the allele, you're very likely to die young from anemia, that from sickle cell, right? And so this is really the first um way, the first disease that we could see of how a genetic variation, a natural genetic variation, right? Like something mutated somewhere along the way, and it provided a evolutionary advantage. But it also created a situation where it's very clear that you can't optimize for everything. You can't, very rarely in nature, is there a mutation that doesn't have some sort of trade-off, right? So the sickle cell allele has a trade-off. This developed in Africa and where malaria is very prevalent. And uh, the advantage was really clear, right? Like if you have that allele, then you survive in a situation where a lot of other people do not survive. However, then you have survived, and then you have created babies with somebody else who has survived, and then your offspring die, right? So you can't optimize for everything. So there is a natural selection benefit to this, but it also has a limit. All right. So, and then now your head is spinning because you're like, wait, what? So, collectivist and individualist cultures. I promise I'll come back. So collectivist cultures, right? So these are cultures where your identity with the group is more important than your identity to individualism, your own personal desires. The goals of the group are those that are prioritized, right? That trust really is in group decisions versus individualist cultures, right? Identity is achieved by your own striving, independence is valued, personal and group goals are often not consistent, right? Like they change depending on who you're talking to, right? But personal goals in general are prioritized above the group goal, right? So why are we talking about this, right? Like, so why are we talking about how, natural selection and collectivistic and individualistic cultures, uh, intersect? Why is this even relevant today, right? How are these related? So here it is, right? The In collectivist societies, what we're looking at is the concept of group selection. We are selecting for the group when we're talking about evolution, right? The evolutionary priority is for the group to continue to survive. Whereas the individualist society, the individualist orientation, it really is about personal success and individual success and development and reproduction, right? So it's more about individual selection. Sorry about the motorcycle, my window's open. Um, but both approaches can be seen as adaptive strategies to keeping the group alive, right? And to evolution, right? Because evolution is about keeping the species alive. But how it goes about doing that is different, right? It's an individualist, one at a time kind of approach, or a collectivist group approach. And so we really understand here that that these two things have to work together to perpetuate the species. Okay, so you we're going to talk about scientific methods now. And really, you do have other classes where you need to know about how to kind of work through the scientific method. That is not for us to do. We're going to cover this so that you kind of understand where the theories that we're going to discuss came from, and so that we can discuss a little bit of how it can go wrong when it's not done correctly. The most important part really is not the nitty-gritty details of how the research is done. Again, that's for other classes. That is not for us. But to understand the strengths and weaknesses of an approach, right? There are lots of different ways to study a problem. And what we really want to focus on is the strengths and weaknesses of any approach. So it's also really important for you to understand what a peer-reviewed paper is, and how really, really critical it is for your success in college to be able to read one correctly. So what does that mean? Um, First of all, I just want to point out to you that on your homework for this module, you are going to have to think about a peer-reviewed paper and be able to locate a peer-reviewed paper, that sort of thing. So you you don't necessarily have to use them frequently in the lower division classes, right, in those first 2 years of college, but it is really important to understand how to find them and how to use them. Okay. So, also this section is a really good way for you to practice your note-taking skills. We are not really going to cover scientific methods in great detail in after this. So it's a really good way for you to practice. Okay, so um what's the difference? Pseudoscience versus science. We hear this word all the time, pseudoscience, and it has these really negative connotations. What does that mean? So it isn't necessarily negative. Pseudoscience is basically science based on something other than following the scientific method. And I think if you think through the things that you know about the world, you will understand that not everything comes from the scientific method, right? Like the scientific method, you come up with a question and a hypothesis and this and that, and then you do the testing and you have to, have controlled studies, and not all knowledge comes to us in that way, right? So just be aware that, science has a very specific definition to it, but pseudoscience doesn't necessarily mean that it's worthless, you know? Okay. So, the it's less important that you know specifically the steps of the scientific method necessarily, so much as it is that you understand that this is how we get something called the evidence base, right? Following the scientific method and gathering data from using it is how we get an evidence base. But you know, we have to understand that like I said before, not everything that we know comes from this methodology, right? So, I like media as a good example of this. There are plenty of media sources that have credible information that is fact-based, but they're not using the scientific method, right? You can have credible information that is based in fact, but it's not about using the scientific method. So we have to be cognizant that that's not the only way to get where we need to go. Okay, so you remember that current psychology slide, the one where I said, well, what about all the other cultures, and what about all the other types of psychologies? So I had to add this word in, the stages in the Western research process. Um, because again, this is just one way to do it. So in the first stage, you're selecting a topic and searching the literature to see what's already been done. If you don't do this, you don't know what's been done, right? Like, why reinvent the wheel? You should use what is already out there. Stage two is developing your theory and formulating a hypothesis, right? So what's your idea? What do you think is going to happen when you test your idea? And then you have to think through, like, how am I going to test this, right? Does it make sense to test my idea by, doing a survey? Does it make sense to test my idea by taking blood samples? If we're trying to get an opinion from people, is a blood sample really going to help you? It is not, right? So you have to select a scientific method that makes sense. And then, just as important as doing a good job of that is running it through what's called an IRB, an institutional review board. And this is the ethical evaluation part of the question. And the IRB, pardon me, the IRB's responsibility is to make sure that your scientific inquiry doesn't hurt the subjects that you're studying. And if you're wondering why that's a problem, like, why would we ever do that? We have a video coming up to talk about that. And then once you've gotten your approval and you've run your scientific method, you've done your study, you've gotten your plan to do your study, then you start collecting your data, right? Like, you start running your study. And then you gotta analyze it and report it out. And this is um really where the rubber hits the road, right? This is where we can really get into some trouble about doing a good job, because there's a lot of different ways that you can analyze data. Some of them can make data look one way or look another way when that's not really the story it really does tell. So we have to be a little bit careful about how it is that we analyze data, and that we're not bringing in our own bias about what we want the data to say when we present what the data actually does say, and then reporting the results. So one of the biggest problems with this is that when we go to report the results, usually what we're doing is we're reporting them in a peer-reviewed journal. What is a peer-reviewed journal, you might ask? Okay, so you write up what you did and your results, and you submit it to a group of professionals who are also in your field. These are usually other professors who are studying the same sort of thing. They don't know who you are. You don't know who they are. It's all been anonymized. They read what you did, and they feed back. Like they say, well, what about this? What about that? I'm not sure I agree with how your data was analyzed because this or that or the other thing. And that is the peer review process, right? It's really, really important that you understand that the peer review process is not like, hey, Joe Bob down the hallway t took a look at my paper and like, marked some grammatical mistakes. That's not what we're talking about here. This is a formalized process between experts in the field to make sure that the results that you're saying that you got make sense. And does this always, is this a foolproof system? It is not. But it's better than just writing something down and being like, see, I told you it's true. And it isn't always. So the peer review process really is an important safeguard that we're uh, the results that we got are what we say that, say that they are. Okay. So, the there are some important things on this slide. Random assignment, independent variable, and dependent variable. Okay, so what does that mean? The random assignment means that we when we're running an experiment, we always have two groups. We have the control group and we have the experimental group. Sometimes we have more than that, but we have at least that in an experiment. And the control group, we don't do anything to. We just do the measurement before and the measurement after of whatever it is that we're trying to figure out. And oftentimes there is a change, right? Whether or not we've done an intervention. So what does that mean? So let's say that what we're measuring is the rate of healing for a wound. Okay, so we get a bunch of people together and they all have, similar boo-boos, and the control group doesn't get Neosporin, and the treatment group puts on Neosporin 3 times a day. Okay, and the question is not, does the Neosporin help to heal the wound? The question actually is, does the Neosporin help to heal the wound better than the wound would have healed without it? So that's what the control group is for, right? So we're measuring against the control group because, of course, it's going to heal anyway. The question is not, does it heal? The question is how well, how fast, that sort of thing, right? So yeah, let's talk more about these. So, no, we'll come. Yeah. Okay. So before we talk more about the independent variable and the dependent variable, the question about the beginning, right? What is a good theory in the first place, right? It has to do all these things, and they have varying levels of importance, I think. Like for example, economy. Does the theory contain only what is necessary to explain the phenomenon in question? Like, I would say that's probably not the most important part of a good theory. I would think that the most important part is predictive accuracy, followed by internal coherence, right? But like, that is up to debate. So I'm curious to know how you would rank these things. So this is kind of the cycle of the theory and hypothesis. You have a theory, and then you hypothesize, and then you collect some data, and then you refine your theory. You're changing it. You're seeing if let's try this one, let's try that one. You're doing a hypothesis, and I just want to point out that when you go to do your personal improvement frameworks, you're going to be doing this because you're going to come up with a theory about what it is that you need and how to go about making a change to meet your goals. And then you're going to try it, right? You're going to try it after you've thought that through and written it down and submitted it to me as your framework. And then you have an opportunity when you go back and like do a check and edit assignment later to refine your theory based on what happened, right? You're going to be able to look at your data, like, I was trying to improve my sleep and I did that by, adding melatonin or whatever. And you collected your data. Well, did that work? No? All right. So you got to refine your hypothesis, right? Like your theory is the same. I have to improve my sleep. How do I do that? How, and then you put in something else. You put in, chamomile tea, whatever it is, right? And then you collect more data. And you're going to be able to do this in real time. We do this all the time, right? It's just trial and error, right? So, the ways that we collect data are varied. I'm not going to go too deeply into what these are, but I do want to point out to you that um, people who collect data come from all levels of education. It isn't just PhD level researchers. It really isn't. You can collect data with the amount of education you have right now. So there are jobs out there that will help you do that. If you've ever talked to a census worker, they're collecting data, right? And census workers, I think, have to have like a high school degree, something like that, right? So collecting data, it doesn't require that you only have a certain level of education. So you can do it too. And then how we analyze our data, right? Like we're trying to both describe what we have found and also put meaning to it, right? Like does what does this data mean is the question. And then replication is, if you do it a second time, will you get the same results? And then very importantly, meta-analysis is when you look at various different experiments that kind of try to measure the same thing. Uh, what's the takeaway from like looking at 20 of these things? Does the takeaway from one look the same as the takeaway from looking at all 20 together? That sort of thing. Okay. So there's other kinds of research beyond experiments. Sometimes we can't always do experiments because humans are human beings and we can't always do experiments on human beings. Naturalistic observation is just watching. Participant observation is, watching from more close up, if that makes sense. And then case study is one. A case study is always a very kind of tricky one because by definition, it's you're studying something that is so rare that you can really only study one at a time. So, it has limited applicability and also, it's hard to know whether what you are studying and the conclusions that you're drawing actually apply to anybody else because you're just looking at that one person. But nevertheless, they can be really, really helpful, especially in cases of like very rare diseases, that sort of thing. Okay, so now we're back to this. Sorry about that. So, the correlational research and everything. So, this is a type of research that we're not doing experiments. We cannot do experiments for everything. Like I said on the last slide, we're trying to measure the relationship between two variables, right? And so, here are some examples at the bottom. So a study examines the relationship between social media usage and levels of anxiety, right? So those are two things that might travel together. Maybe they're causal, maybe they're not, but we can measure the relationship between them. We can also measure the connection between physical activity and happiness. You can see from the examples on the slide that there are lots of things that might impact the variables, right? So like, all sorts of things could cause anxiety in college students. And just because, they use a lot of social media does not mean that the social media causes anxiety. Maybe the anxiety causes the social media usage, right? Or maybe they're not actually like the relationship isn't between these two things, but some hidden third variable, right? The you can see how that might be the case. So these are in your book, so I'm not gonna spend too much time on them, but this is how you would graph correlation. Okay, so let's talk about causation, right? So we've talked about this a little bit. So, in order to determine that something is affected by something else, we need to have an independent variable and then an independent variable. Okay. So the independent variable is the one that is manipulated by the researcher to figure out whether the other one changes. What does that mean? Hold on, we're gonna get there. Don't worry. So what has changed versus what changes as a result. The independent variable is always the one that we are changing, right? And the way that you can think about that is with the I. Independent variable, changing, ing, right? And the dependent variable, changed, changed, dependent, right? So that's how I think about it anyway. You can probably come up with better ones, but those are the ones that I think of. Random assignments. Again, we have to, those wounds, we can't just put, the people with the biggest boo-boos in the control group or in the treatment group. That's not random, right? Then we don't necessarily know that what we put in, which is what? It's the neosporin, right? So, that's the independent variable is the neosporin, and the size of the wound is the dependent variable, right? For the random assignment, we absolutely have to um, put those people into the treatment group or the not treatment group without regard to what kind of wound they actually have, right? Because if we were looking at the wound itself, we would not really be measuring without putting in extra variables that we didn't intend to, like size of wound, right? And then we talked about control already, right? That's the one without the the neosporin. Okay, so here's some practice ones for you. You can pause. I would actually recommend that you pause the video to read them through and decide what you think, and then I will run you through the answers. Okay, are you ready? I'm gonna run you through the answers in 3, 2, 1. All right. I hope you got those right. If you didn't, there are some other good examples that I can give you, so you can just reach out. All right. So there's a video on Canvas called the Shadow of the Thalidomide Tragedy. I want you to go watch that and come back to the lecture after you've finished watching that video. It can be a little bit hard to watch, so just you don't have to look at all the pictures if you don't want to. Okay, so hopefully you're back from watching the video. Again, if you haven't watched the video yet, please go and do that. Um, so the point of the video is there are many things that went wrong in this scientific method around testing thalidomide. And if there had been proper controls and control groups for thalidomide when it was being developed, what would have happened? Would it have been outright banned? If you think it would have, I mean, maybe it would have, but if they had really done a thorough evaluation, what they would have found is what? That it has applicable uses where it's really quite powerful, but that it also has very powerful contraindications, that is to say, pregnancy, right? So it's not that it would not have been approved, it's that it would have been approved with warning labels, right? So that is a really strong example of the failure of the scientific method. Here's some natural experiments for you. The Dutch famine is one of them. The Dutch famine, um, is a time during World War II when the Nazis blocked the Dutch Holland at that time it was called. It's now called the Netherlands from getting food. And so for a certain period of time in 1944 and 1945, the Dutch people basically were being starved to death. And it provided a really strong opportunity to evaluate the impact of being deprived of nutrition during pregnancy on the developing baby. Obviously, this is not an experiment we could ever do ethically, right? On folks in general, but this is what a natural experiment is. The Great Smoky Mountain Study, similar natural experiment, a little more positive this time. So they came into a bunch of money all at once. And there was data on mental health before the money arrived and after the money arrived, and the nothing else had really changed. And the question was, did the increase in family income lead to a reduction in psychiatric symptoms? And it absolutely did. And basically what that tells you is that, being less desperate, and having the things that you need to survive day to day improves your mental health, right? Which, we know that, but now we know it with data, right? So, what about a control group, right? We need a control group to establish cause effect, right? You remember this slide? So, there are various ways to do this. Within subjects design basically means comparing folks after something happens to their data, the same data from the people before it happens. You can do a time series, you can do statistical controls. These are all things that you will learn about when you do statistics classes. Psychology statistics classes can be really interesting in this way. Okay. So, when we do research with human participants, we need to be very cognizant of how we do that, right? So we need to make sure that we're following all these guidelines. How did we end up with these guidelines? So this is another video for you to watch. Again, pause the lecture and then go and watch the video and come back. Nope, we're not going to watch it together though. Um, so Milgram really is an indirect driving force behind institutional review boards, because of the questionable ethical things that he did to get his research done, right? These folks were really negatively impacted by the study itself. But he's not Mengele, right? If you know who Mengele was, he was the doctor, the Nazi doctor who did all sorts of unspeakable things, in the camps in the name of science, right? So like Milgram's research really did contribute to social psychology in a significant way, but the question is it worth it, right? And how far are we willing to go to get that significant data, right? Because Mengele, most of what he did was nonsense, but you can see in your head that there is a universe in which you could do really horrible human experiments and get really good important data on how human bodies react to this or that or the other thing, right? And the question becomes, is it worth it? If we could kill 50 people and get a cure for cancer, is that worth it? Is it worth it ethically? Is it worth it to society? Like this is for your philosophy class, right? Like this is not for your psychology class. But you see the problem. You see the question at hand. So this is another video for you to watch. This is also about ethics in studies. This one is problematic on many levels, not the least of which is that it went on for decades. So, again, it's in Canvas, so please pause the lecture and go back and take a look at that. Okay, so hopefully you took strong notes on the video. My bad for not telling you that beforehand. But like, the idea is, why is this important in science and psychology today? And you don't need to have taken video too many notes during the video to think through this question now, right? So um, there are so many things about the Tuskegee experiment that really help us think through ethical science practice and ethical psychology as a science, right? So we need to be very careful about subjects and how we handle subjects in when we're pursuing knowledge in science. So um, you know, there, as I said, there are so many things that we can say about this. But one of the things that we can say is that there was actually useful data that came out of this study. However, when we go back to that question of is it worth it? The problem that we encounter in the is it worth it question is now, uh, as a not insignificant result of the Tuskegee study, we're in a position where an entire population of folks are less likely to engage with the medical profession as a whole, the research profession. This is not the only example of the African American community being taken advantage of and developing a very understandable mistrust of the established medical and research organization. If you're interested in this topic, by the way, I highly recommend reading the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. It's a really, really interesting book about and actually it might be a movie by now. I don't know. It's really, really interesting exploration of how um, a single black woman in, I think, the 50s made huge contributions to human medical science, but very much to her own detriment and to that of her family. It's really, really worth a read if you're interested in any of the kind of related topics. Okay, so if you need to check in or you have any questions, this is the way to get to me, and I look forward to talking to you guys really soon. All right, thanks so much. Bye-bye.